Welcome to Leadership Story Talks, where culture-driven leaders share real-life stories of challenge, growth, and connection. Join Jerome and Julienne Ryan as they explore how storytelling shapes leadership, strengthens teams, and brings employee engagement to life.
And there I use a principle that if disruption is inevitable, accelerate it, because most important is to not fight it. In fact, control the timetable for disruption. So whenever we see disruption is imminent, we just accelerate it. Okay. For example, when we moved to hardware to software only, it short-term impacted our top line, but it was a good decision. So that's one thing. But coming back to the ups and downs, value systems don't change during bad time. In fact, you can double down on them.
Hello again. And we just heard from Anil Singhal. That was a great interview. It was a tough time for me to just choose one quote because there were so many things. So I really encourage everybody to go back to episode 136 with Anil Singhal. But today we're going to talk about this idea of disruption. And I thought we'd do things maybe a little bit differently than perhaps we're used to and start with a question for us. And that is, when were you faced with a disruption of some kind, and what was your reaction to it?
Yes, that's a great question for our listening audience, and then also to think. And when we talked to Anil, it was very impressive to see how building a culture and him using values was the mainstay and an important foundational tool. Because as he was talking about disruption, I was thinking about all the downsizing and restructurings and changes I was part of internally when I was working in companies, and then what I witnessed with clients. And the ones who navigate the best experiences is when communication is there and it's transparent and there's a certain rhyme or reason. Because what happens in a bit of change, it's really easy to go into bunker mentality and shut down and really go on defensive. So sometimes changes don't are not instituted in the way they had hoped because they forgot to factor in the human factor. What was a conversation way above did not get translated all the way down the food chain. And a lot of times things are wasted in the way of opportunities and talent and time because people did not have all the key facts. They didn't get to see leadership really stepping forward and sharing information that would have been valuable. And then a lot of talent leaves, because they're like, I'm out of here because I don't know what's happening next. Let me just write my own ticket. So those are some things that came to my mind. So values and transparency and communication are key when there's disruption.
Yeah. And the fact that Anil was saying, that they double down on the values when there's a time of crisis, as opposed to, shying away from them or changing them. That it really is a guiding light. And for those of you who have not listened to that episode, I really do encourage you to go, because he talks a lot about fairness as being one of their main values, and that's kind of how they make decisions. So, lots of practical insights in that episode. For me, it's funny, when I was thinking about disruption, I went a different way. I was just thinking, like a lot of people, I'm sure, COVID must come up when you talk about disruption. At least for me, it did. And for me, April 22nd, 2020, I was in a hospital in Brooklyn, and on one side of the hospital, outside actually, when I arrived to the hospital, there were tents all over, and those were tents that were specifically taking care of people with COVID. The lockdown in New York City at that time had started maybe 3 weeks before that, and so there I was with my wife, who was heavily pregnant. And we walk into the hospital, and it was a scheduled C-section, and so we did all the routine things, and got the tests, the COVID tests, and all that. And then she went one way, I went another. Got into my scrubs, and then I met her into the OR, and they did what they did, and about an hour. Well, I don't know how long it was, but however time went by, whatever time went by, there was my daughter Lola, and she was born kind of miraculously, in the face of this huge global crisis that was going on, and there she was. And then, as we knew would happen, when they cleaned her up and everything, and they stitched my wife back up, and then they put her in a wheelchair, and she was holding Lola, and then again I had to go another way. Whereas when my son was born, I went with my wife to the hospital, back to the hospital room, and we stayed there for 72 hours, I think it was. And there I had to go home because that was the COVID protocol. The partners could not stay in the hospital. And so
Mhm.
so I left, and they went that way. So you can imagine my heart, where it was at that point. And so I went home. And so I was thinking about, reaction to that kind of disruption. My reaction was to clean the apartment from top to bottom. It's never been that clean. That's all I did was just clean, 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 clean. And then I did get a call, and obviously I would call my wife to see how she was. And at on one of our calls, maybe 24 hours in, she said, it's crazy. I'm alone here in this room with my daughter. I've got this huge scar that really hurts. I can't do much, and nobody's coming to the room. Like I've been ringing for the nurse to come, and nobody's
Mhm.
coming, and I can't feed Lola, and it's been hours. And Lola's crying, etc. And then so I decided, okay, well, I can't go to the hospital, so I'm going to call the hospital. So I called the hospital, and I said, my wife's in this room, nobody's been there for a few hours. And say, oh, we're so sorry, it's so crazy. And of course it's crazy because it's COVID. But then I called back my wife afterwards, and I asked, is somebody there? Is somebody there? And then finally somebody did come, and they said, yeah, your husband called, and and she was like, oh my gosh. So that's what I could do, at least in the face of that sort of crisis. But for me, it was interesting to see that when there is a disruption or a crisis in my own life, and it goes for work too, the tendency is like, oh boy, what do we do now? There's a kind of helplessness to it. And so, you do other things. Like I'm cleaning the apartment because I
Mhm.
can't actually deal with the situation that's in front of me. And a lot of times that's what happens at work too. You're not
Mhm.
necessarily in a position to make decisions that are going to go the way that you want them to go. You depend on other people, or you depend on external circumstances and all of that. And so, what do you do in the face of that? So, I found something to do that was productive. I mean, we needed a clean apartment. It's COVID, et cetera. They're going to come from a hospital. We
Mhm.
need to have that. So, I think it's about finding those things that are productive in the moment. And then, the opportunity arises to actually take an action that is
Mhm.
helpful, that is productive, as opposed to sort of retreating, and kind of like being in a corner and saying, oh my gosh, I wish things were different. I wish
Mhm.
that all these external things weren't happening. Wouldn't it be so different for my life? And then as a result, you're not really in action at all. You're
Mhm.
you're not taking any actions. So that's what came up for me in terms of, that lesson around disruption and reaction to it.
And that's valuable because in all the times I alluded to, one of it is what does that group have in control of? What can they do? What can they be doing in the interim? Not talking about false promises. It's like this part of the work exists now and giving reasonable, honest answers and
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
lying, just being transparent in what is within our control of information. The other thing I loved about the interview, to go into, if there's another point to listen for, is when Anil said they had merged with other companies and they had acquired the leadership and retain them. So it wasn't like, well, date for a few months and then off you go and go find your
Mm-hmm.
next gig. They actually kept the talent. So what was very interesting is that talent that was retained were their goodwill ambassadors when change was happening. And he had said something like, one of the executives told another one, no, 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 they really mean this. They do acquire people and companies and retain them. So your communication that happens internally becomes very, very important. Who's your goodwill ambassador? Because it can sound like, a press release or just a lot of words, but when you see, theory and then theory in use, then you're in good stead. So
Yeah.
listening and learning and advocating, and yeah, crazy times.
Yeah.
But good examples, but always something to learn. And I just thought he offered a good example that things are possible. Your
Hmm.
values and your foundation is the groundwork of what you do. And it's like a lot what appealed to me when I met you in the narrative group.
Mm.
What's the values first? What's the foundations to our work? And how do you want to show up,
Yeah.
in the public space and in your everyday corporate space?
Yeah. What do you believe in, and are you walking that talk, basically? So yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for those insights and reflections, and thanks, listeners, for being here as always. And again, you can go to narrative.com to find this episode and many more episodes in the Narrative Leadership Story Talks vault. So hopefully we will see you again soon, and really excited for our next one. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.